Thanks for watching my video. I will be showing all of the steps I took to set all of my rebar, lay out radiant heating tubes, and set up perimeter forms. If you want to skip to a section, you can go to the times shown here. The instructions for the build deck show how the rebar needs to be laid out. These wires were made to tie the build deck forms together. I am bending them into hangers that will hold the rebar in the beam pockets and also keep them evenly spaced. I put rebar seats in the pockets as a temporary support for the hangers. They are spaced 8 feet apart and will be removed after all of the rebar is tied together and before the concrete is poured. The hangers are placed every 48 inches. Every other one is on a rebar seat. Rebar can now be set into the pockets of the build deck forms. I'm using 16-gauge wire to tie the rebar into the corners of the hanger. This will hold the two pieces of rebar apart and keep them close to being parallel. Rebar seats can now be added on top of the concrete forms every 48 inches. When placing rebar, you are required to overlap the next piece by 40 times the diameter. That means that if you are using 1/2 inch rebar, you need at least a 20-inch overlap. If you are using 5/8, you would need a minimum of 25 inches. I'm using my tying wire to hang all of the rebar in the pockets. After this is done, the temporary rebar seats can be removed. Now I can fill in the rest of the rebar at 12-inch increments across the entire floor. Up until this point, I have been tying all of the rebar by hand. I got the automatic rebar tying machine BT-890 Pro from Nutri. I have a link to it in the description. It saved me at least a day of being on my hands and knees. It is totally worth it, and it can also be used to attach the tubing for my radiant heat. When you get to the end of a course, the rebar needs to be bent to go into the wall. I am measuring to where I need to make the bend. The rebar comes in 20-foot lengths. When you get to the end of a course, you may need to cut it to length to make it fit without wasting material. I'm using an angle grinder to make my cut. I don't own a tool for bending rebar, so I built one from wood that was laying around, and an eye bolt that I purchased for under $3. My bender is pretty simple. Just stick the rebar through the eye bolt, measure to the bend point, and use some sort of iron pipe as a lever to make the bend. I used a bar clamp, because that is what I had. The bent rebar is hooked over the top of the piece at the perimeter that is running perpendicular, and is then tied off. Before the concrete is poured, you will want to add holes for ventilation, plumbing and electrical service. This will save a lot of trouble later, because concrete with rebar is tough to drill through. Mark and cut or drill into the top of the block, and then break out all of the pieces that you can. There is a carrying beam directly below my hole. so I need to add an elbow to my pipe. I am drilling holes at a 45-degree angle so I can find the location on the other side. There was not an easy way to make a sloping hole. The best thing that I could think of was to use a multi-tool to cut chunks out. If you have any better ideas, feel free to leave them in the comments. I went down into the basement and located the holes that I had drilled from above. I used a piece of the pipe to mark the area that need to be cut out. The sawzall worked well to cut out the rest of the opening. If you have been enjoying my video, please take a minute to subscribe to my channel. By subscribing, you will be notified when I release new content. Once the opening has been cleaned up adequately, the pipe can be put into the hole. I'm concerned that the concrete will hold moisture and eventually rust the pipe, so I wrap the pipe in zip tape to protect it. I use spray foam insulation all around the pipes. This serves two purposes. It secures the pipe so it will not move, and it also fills in the gaps so the concrete does not leak out of the form. I am installing radiant heat in the concrete slab. There are multiple circuits of PEX tubing in this heating zone. I made a template so that all of the tubes will line up with the manifold. Using this template, I can neatly drill holes into the foam blocks in the utility room. The PEX tubing comes in 300-foot lengths and can get tangled up fairly easily. I'm screwing a block of wood to the floor to set the coil on. As you can see, this works well and didn't cost me anything to build. The end of the PEX tubing is put through one of the holes I drilled in the foam block, so it hangs below by 2 feet. I am attaching the tubing to the underside of the rebar, because I was concerned that it would be too close to the surface of the concrete. If you are using zip ties to attach to the rebar, you will need to trim off all of the tails so they don't stick up through the concrete. I used the zip ties for all of one garage bay to see how long it takes. On the second bay, I decided to try the rebar tying tool. This tool was twice as fast for attaching the radiant tubing. If this sounds interesting to you, there is a link to the tool in the description. I'm using 2x12s for my concrete forms. I will be using them later as floor joists, so I am covering them with plastic to keep them clean and to keep them from sticking. My build block foundation wall is already level, so I built a jig to locate a temporary block on the form that will keep the top of the form level all the way around. The jig locates from the top of the form down to the seat, so differences in board width will not affect elevation. When the corners are screwed together, it is important that they are vertical. Since my form was cut square, all I need to do is make sure they are flush with each other. I'm using one screw to hold the next piece in place, until I can make a more secure connection. The chew bifer is spanning across the joint. It will keep the form straighter, and it will give me a place that I can screw my bracing chew later. I put a screw into the corners of the foundation forms, then ran a string between them so I could level and straighten the forms. There are plastic dividers with the built-in screw strips in the build block forms that I use for the foundation. Every 2 feet I am adding a screw through the bottom of the perimeter form and into the screw strip. Now the temporary blocks can be removed from the inside of the form. I'm using 2x4s for my temporary bracing. The stakes need to be driven deep enough into the ground that they will not move while the concrete is being poured. The brace needs to be attached to the form and to the stake. I'm screwing the brace to the stake first. When the brace is screwed to the form, I am either pushing the form out or pulling it in so the edge is lined up with the string. Now everything is ready for the concrete to get poured. If you have enjoyed following my project, subscribe to my channel and you will be notified when my next video comes out.